9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is the DSR Podcast. Hello and welcome to a special Need to Know episode about the events of the past few days and what they mean for the United States, our national security, geopolitics, and of course I'm referring to the Alaska summit last Friday and then the follow-up event that took place yesterday in Washington, D.C. We're recording this on a Tuesday, and that of course is the meeting between President Trump, President Zelensky, and 7 leaders from Europe. We are very fortunate to have with us our friend General Mark Hertling, who served as the commanding general for the U.S. Army in Europe, knows what's going on in Ukraine inside out, and obviously brings to this a really valuable perspective. And so I just want to start with that. You watched what happened on Friday. You watched what happened yesterday, and maybe some of Trump's little appearances on TV this morning. And I'm just wondering, where do you think we are? How have the past few days changed anything, if they have changed anything?
First, I want to say thanks for having me with you, David. It's always good to be with you on this show because we speak the truth. When we talk about what's happened over the last few days, a lot of people want to start at Friday, and I'm going to go a couple of days before that, if you don't mind, because as I was watching the preparation for the summit and the announcement that it was going to occur and the fits and starts that occurred with it, where it was going to be, how it was going to be undertaken, what kind of planning was in motion. It seemed to me, and again, I'm not part of the administration, I'm not in the National Security Council, so I wasn't there, but it seemed to me there was a lot of ad hocism in putting this together. And whenever you're talking about putting together a major diplomatic effort to stop a war specifically, there usually is a whole lot of planning. Now, that may have been going on under the radar, but truthfully, it didn't seem like some of the principals were all that involved in preparing for what was going to happen with a visit from President Putin. Then you get to the actual event on last Friday itself, and you see the atmospherics of the connection and what was going on with the preparation for the engagement. And I have to say, and I would say this about any president, the atmospherics were just a little bit discouraging, well, more than a little bit discouraging for me in terms of how the military was used as part of the stagecraft. The F-22s parked on the tarmac, so you had to walk past an entire squadron of them when you got off the presidential airplanes, both the president of Russia and the president of the United States. Obviously, the red carpet, the joint force of Army, Navy, and Air Force soldiers with an honor guard saluting President Putin, a indicted war criminal by the Hague, as he walked from his plane to meet President Trump, the obvious cordial greeting by one president to another. And then even as they were walking to the stand for the photographs, both of them looked up in the air. At the time, I didn't know what they were looking at, but I suspected it was some type of aircraft flyover. And it turned out to be a B-2 bomber surrounded by a couple of other 5th generation fighter jets. Now, the F-22s and F-35s are all stationed at Elmerdorf Richardson, that base where they were at. But a B-2 bomber has to fly in all the way from Whitman Air Force Base in Missouri. So if this was part of an attempt at either intimidation or showing of military strength, it was an expensive one, number one. And number two, it just didn't seem to fit in with the gravitas of the event. And then what we saw in terms of the changing of the our president's narrative from going in position of how important a ceasefire is, and it is in any kind of negotiation, because a ceasefire allows breathing room for the negotiators to talk about what they're going to do, and changing that narrative and plan to be, well, maybe just going right into a peace treaty would be the best way to do things, and that would advantage one over another, especially when the one guy that was involved wasn't even at the meeting. So, David, I'll stop there, and that got us through Friday. I'm sure we're going to talk a lot more about what happened yesterday, but man, I'm exhausted just talking about last Friday.
Well, I appreciate it, and I set the stage. We're also joined by our friend Angela Stent, a professor at Georgetown University, a specialist on Russia, and also a specialist on Vladimir Putin. We talked a little bit before all this was going to happen, Angela, and I can only imagine that sitting in Moscow today on Tuesday, Vladimir Putin pretty happy with the way things went, both on Friday and on Monday. But maybe I have that wrong. What do you think?
No. I mean, if you look at the Russian media, you listen to the officials, they think this was a great win for Putin. I'm sorry, I logged in a little late and I didn't hear everything that General Hertling said. But I mean, to me, it looked like a great success for Putin. He literally got the red carpet treatment, as was said. He's an indicted war criminal. He got a fulsome handshake. He was actually applauded by President Trump. And even though the meeting ended earlier than it should have, they didn't have their lunch. And we've now seen the leaked, menu of what they were going to have. Clearly, not everything went exactly as maybe President Trump thought it would. But yes, the Russians are saying, we're equals. And, we can come on to what happened yesterday with the European leaders and with President Zelensky. But they've already said that, whatever happens with Ukraine cannot disturb the most important aspect, which is the U.S.-Russian relationship. They have not agreed to any trilateral Putin-Trump-Zelensky meeting or even a bilateral Putin-Zelensky meeting. They're now saying, well, maybe it'll take place with lower-level officials. I mean, they've maybe talked about the foreign ministers. So I think when you look at everything that happened in Alaska, and then you examine really what happened yesterday in the White House, you wonder whether we're any closer to getting any of this resolved, to get the war resolved, than we were before all this happened. I mean, the European leaders, it was important that they came. It was important that President Zelensky managed to get a meeting with President Trump in the Oval Office, which was not catastrophic as it was in February, and where at least outwardly there were smiles and handshakes, and that there was agreement verbally that the United States would be prepared to get involved with security guarantees for Ukraine were there to be a settlement. But that's all kind of vague. We don't know the contours of it. And again, as was said, there was no agreement to have a ceasefire. And President Trump sort of reversed himself. When he went into the meeting, he was in Alaska. He said, there has to be a ceasefire first. And at the end, he said, no, we'll go straight to peace talks. But, those peace talks can take forever. And meanwhile, Putin thinks that he's still winning the war, and he is in no hurry to sit down and actually work out a durable peace agreement with President Zelensky.
And David, can I add one thing to what Professor Stent just said, which I think is fascinating? When Putin and Trump were together in Alaska, the amount of bullets that were flying from Russia into Ukraine dissipated a bit. Last night, when Zelensky was in Washington with all the European partners, it was one of the most horrific attacks across the board from Russia into Ukraine, killing 22 people over the last several months. So you can see that, the true purpose for a ceasefire and the reason why President Putin doesn't want one is exhibited in what's going on the ground.
Well, I mean, he had he had Trump on TV today, essentially arguing that Russia, controls all the land it's taken, that Russia is entitled to Crimea. He was talking Russian talking points. He's made it clear that Russia is setting the terms of this. He was for ceasefires against it. The Europeans pushed him for it. He was for security guarantees. By the end of the day yesterday, the U.S. would only be consulted on security guarantees. They were going to be a trilateral meeting, then talk to Putin, then it's going to be a bilateral meeting. Now the Russians have said, as Angela pointed out, that There may be pre-meetings. And so I go back to you, Angela, and then I'll go to Mark on this. But there was a lot of talk in the media yesterday about how, well, this was a much better meeting for Zelensky than it was the last time because Zelensky, got into a shouting match. I'm not sure.
Mm-mm.
I'm not sure it was a better meeting. What if Zelensky's being set up here by Trump and by Putin to be the obstacle to peace? And that the United States uses that to pull back from its involvement and its support. And it creates a bigger wedge between the US and the Europeans, which is always Putin's goal. This could be a much worse meeting than the meeting that he had earlier, couldn't it?
So first of all, the bar was pretty low, right, going into this. Zelensky wore a suit. Nobody accused him, of being disrespectful because he was wearing military fatigues. They didn't tell him, at least publicly, you don't have any cards. So the only reason people are saying it's better is because it wasn't a shouting match. But as I say, that was unprecedented in February. I agree with you completely. I mean, I think one possible outcome of all of this is that President Zelensky rightly, why should Ukraine give up territory to Russia that Russia doesn't control? And when President Trump talks about land swaps, there's no land swap. I mean, the Ukrainians are supposed to cede the parts of the Donbass that Russia doesn't control yet. And so what's quite possible is that, Putin will say, well, these are our terms. We'll pause the fighting. We'll freeze the conflict along the battle lines, but we have to get this extra territory from Ukraine. President Zelensky can't do that. A, constitutionally he can't do it, and B, he'll be out of office if he does something like that. And then, of course, they will blame Zelensky for the fact that the war hasn't ended. And President Trump, even in the last few days, has been posting on social media that it's up to Zelensky to end the war. It isn't up to Zelensky to end the war. It's up to Russia to end the war. They were the ones who invaded, and they're the ones, who keep on attacking.
Yeah, no question about it. Mark, what do you think of this, avenue or direction of the analysis? I would point out, by the way, I can't resist it because you mentioned earlier Zelensky's garb in his earlier meeting, and you mentioned that the next meeting may be one of foreign ministers. That Russia's foreign minister arrived in Alaska wearing a sweatshirt that said CCCP, that said Union of Soviet Socialist Republics on it. I mean, talk about outrageous and insulting and sort of tipping your hand. I don't know. Did you have a reaction to that, Mark? Or
Yeah, again, we're talking about atmospherics that shouldn't be important in any kind of critical negotiations like this. But if I could, David, I'm going to comment on what you mentioned about the meeting yesterday. I agree with you. First of all, the main purpose I think Zelensky had was not to piss Trump off. He was quiet, he was reserved, he was respectful, and yet, I don't think our president was attempting to get him to come off that reserved approach. But whatever, it took incredible executive presence for Zelensky to get through that meeting. What I saw too was the president was pretty bold in the Oval Office, and he was running the show. And I'm not a body language expert, but what I saw when they got in the room with all the European leaders, the president appeared to me to be a little bit cowed. And I don't know if he was playing that game because he just didn't want to listen to the European leaders, but he realized he had a bunch of smart people around the table that were reframing and going with facts what Putin had told him the previous Friday. Some of the things that came out of the meeting on the Friday session where Putin was just doing as much lying as we've seen in a politician, well, I'll say as much lying as some other politicians, let's put it that way, I'm sure were corrected by all the people sitting around the table. And one individual that I think was the most important that didn't get a lot of press, and that was President Stubb of Finland. Having just been in the Nordic and Baltic countries this summer, Finland and Sweden got it going on. They understand what's happening. And for the first time, both of them have no longer stayed a neutral party, and they have joined the alliance based on requirements versus desires. They know what's happening, and I think having President Stubb in that meeting really, and basically saying, hey, I've got an 800-mile border with these Russians. I know what they're all about, and I know what they're going to do next. So how about listening to me back here in Washington? I think that was probably as important as anybody else sitting around the table.
Yeah, on that point, Angela, today our president appeared on the Fox News network and made a comment about how Ukraine could never possibly be in NATO because there was no way that Russia would ever accept having NATO at its borders. And I thought, well wait a minute. Let's just wait a minute. NATO is at its borders. I mean, Mark is talking about this recent addition. By that logic, Finland shouldn't be in NATO, nor should any of the other countries that are at its border. And it shows, something that Mark was talking about earlier, which is we don't have a National Security Council. We don't have a president who listens to Russia experts. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and it shows on a regular basis.
Yeah, and I mean, the prime example of this is also Mr. Witkoff, right, who has gone and negotiated with Putin, I think, 4 times for hours. This is a real estate developer. He has no background in this area. My understanding is that he has no Russia experts on his team. We know that he has gone to these conversations without going to the U.S. Embassy, without using American interpreters, that he has used Russian interpreters, which, has occasionally happened before in the past, but very rarely with an American president. So we have no idea what the nature of the conversations are, but he comes out, in essence, repeating everything that Putin has told him. And so, yes, of course, Russia's already surrounded by NATO countries and more NATO countries now because of the invasion of Ukraine, to wit, Finland and Sweden. And I think, your listeners have to remember the whole NATO issue was a pretext for Putin to invade Ukraine. But the real causes of this go much deeper. He really doesn't believe that Ukraine is a country. He believes that it belongs to Russia. He's been telling even American officials that since the early 90s in St. Petersburg, when he wasn't yet the president of Russia. And so the invasion of Ukraine is a prelude to, the desire to subordinate Ukraine, if not occupy, but at least subordinate it, and then intimidate even countries who are in NATO, particularly the Baltic states and Poland. So I think to say that Russia will never allow Ukraine to join NATO, it's really not Russia's to decide. It's the members of NATO who decide whether a country joins or not. And so all of the things that you've been hearing recently, again, that the big mistake was the US should never have enlarged NATO. That's really not the issue. It's a much deeper issue for Putin. And that's really reversing the consequences of the Soviet collapse.
Yeah, and the Russians, of course, claim that Ukraine is part of Russia. But Angela is an expert on this, and she will confirm for me that really, technically, if you go back to Kievan Rus, Russia should be a part of Ukraine.
Well, certainly in the period of Kievan Rus, that those lands were much better developed than Moscow, or St. Petersburg was a swamp, and Moscow was some kind of primitive gathering. So, I mean, the history, and I was taught, people of my generation were certainly taught the history of Russia and Ukraine from the Russian point of view. But you have to go out and read it from the Ukrainian point of view, and it's a very different story. So,
David, one of the other things that, and I'm hoping maybe Angela can confirm this for me, is my understanding, having traveled a lot in Ukraine. But one of the other things that the president said this morning was how he had been told that most of the people in the area and this is the old trope of most of the people in the area Russia's looking to subsume are all Russian speakers. And what I'd suggest is most Ukrainians can speak Russian as well as Ukraine. And if there are a lot of Russian speakers in the Donbass, it's because during the entire time of the Soviet occupation and Soviet Ukraine, Ukrainian as a language was banned by the Russians inside of Ukraine. It's the only nation state that had its own language banned by an occupying force. So there's there's kind of the rest of the story, as you say. Maybe President Trump doesn't really understand the culture or the people that he's talking about.
I mean, certainly, President Zelensky's first language was Russian. He grew up in the center of Ukraine to Soviet Jewish parents, and those people mainly spoke Russian. Of course, they learned Ukrainian if they wanted to, but that doesn't mean that they didn't have a Ukrainian national identity. And I think that's a huge mistake that many people make. Just because someone speaks Russian, that doesn't mean they identify as Russians. And you can make all these analogies. Do people who live in Montreal, do they feel that they're French? No, they feel like Canadian. I mean, there are many other examples around the world. So that's really a fallacy to think if someone speaks Russian, that they must identify with Russia.
Yeah, and also as a descendant of some Jews who were settled in that part of Ukraine, the Russians didn't send the Jews to that part of Ukraine because they thought it was a great place.
Yeah,
it was not prime real estate that they were handing out there. Mark, let's switch the topic a little bit, because nobody wanted to talk about land yesterday, land swaps or anything else. The reason being, of course, it's an impossible issue. The Ukrainians don't want to give up their land, shouldn't have to give up their land. The Russians want to claim as much as they can. So they were talking a lot about security guarantees and Article 5 like security guarantees, or Article 5 light security guarantees. And, it raises the NATO question again, because if you're going to have an Article 5 like guarantee, you might as well have NATO, which frankly, personally to me, seems like the right solution. But with regard to the security guarantees, by the end of the day, it seemed like the U.S. wouldn't put boots on the ground. Trump specifically said that. The U.S. would just coordinate. The Europeans would be responsible for it. But it seems less and less clear that Putin is open to all of these ideas. It doesn't, this seems like a talking point where the White House and Witkoff are like, well, yeah, they'll agree to security guarantees, but it's not clear that they will or what they would look like. Is that your perception, Mark?
It is absolutely my interpretation of all this. And it's like people saying we should put a no-fly zone over Ukraine. It's a lot harder to do than it is to say. And when you're talking about security guarantees, or as both Secretary Rubio and Witkoff mentioned in terms of Article 5 light, if you're going to do an Article 5, why, as you just said, why aren't you a part of NATO? There is no such thing as an Article 5 light, because the Article 5 means that everyone will come to your aid. So you would have to get a whole nother set of documentation saying, here's people who will come to the aid if whatever agreement is signed is violated. Now, let me take you one step further, David. I'm probably old enough to know, being one of the few people that pulled border patrol between East and West Germany as a young second lieutenant, and then pulled it again between West Germany and Czechoslovakia when that was a nation in 1975 through 1989. And when you're talking about security guarantees and the so-called boots on the ground, an expression I absolutely abhor, you're talking about putting forces somewhere along a wall, like there was in the Cold War. And I hate to tell old war stories, but one of my first border experiences on the East German, West German border was seeing a bunch of East Germans trying to escape and go over that wall and being shot by each East German guards right in front of me. And there's nothing we could do about it. So are we going to put up a wall between the Donbass and the rest of Ukraine? And is it going to be like some of the other territories that are now frozen conflicts, like the ones in Moldova and Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia and some of the other places where the Russians have taken a piece of land and then caused all sorts of turmoil because it's remained frozen in place? Are we going to put a UN force there, a NATO force there? Who is going to be there guarding that piece of land for this security agreement? Now we're seeing President Putin saying, well, I don't really want NATO forces on the ground in Ukraine. I'd remind everybody that eastern border of Ukraine with Russia is about 400 miles long. So that's a hell of a Cold War dynamic where you would have to put a whole lot of patrolling forces if you put up some type of wall to prevent people from going one place to another. These are the devils in the details that should be parsed out when you do a cessation of fire and a peace treaty that don't come when you immediately go to the kind of things that both Trump and Putin want.
Yeah, I would say one thing before I get to a final question for each of you, which both of you know, but I'm just sort of saying it for the benefit of the guests. NATO is a defensive alliance. It's never played an offensive role in almost 80 years. Secondly, Article 5 doesn't require that everybody actually respond. It says they will respond as they see fit, which, again, it dilutes this whole Russian narrative of threat. So naturally, my last question, first for Angela and then for Mark, is where do we go from here? What do you expect is going to happen next? The Russians have made some rumblings about next level meetings. I feel today no closer to a constructive peace process than I felt on Thursday afternoon. How do you feel, Angela?
I agree with you completely. I think nothing is really clear. I think what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks is President Trump will say, and maybe his administration is trying to do that they're trying to push for a Putin-Zelensky meeting. I would be shocked if such a meeting took place. President Putin regards President Zelensky not as his equal. President Trump's his equal. President Zelensky isn't. Putin has said he's illegitimate because they haven't had elections. So I can't see any circumstances in which he would meet with him. So, and then of course, if President Trump is saying that a trilateral meeting with him will take place after that, I don't think that's going to happen either. I think the Europeans will try and keep trying to persuade President Trump that, he has to push forward this. They should think about a ceasefire. The Europeans haven't given up on that. But I think, frankly, you're going to see continued Russian bombardments, the killing of civilians, bombing schools and hospitals. This is just going to continue. The Russians will try and take a little bit more territory, but a huge human cost to them. So I think this war is going to continue. And I find it very difficult to see how things change. The only time that Putin will change what he's doing is if he really thinks he can't win. And in order for him to think that, we'd have to have much more robust sanctions. And President Trump has threatened them, but he hasn't done anything about them. And you'd have to have all the military equipment, particularly the air defenses that the Ukrainians need, both from Europe, buying them from the US, but from the US too. And absent those developments, Putin, I think, will think that he can continue to do this with impunity, because so far President Trump hasn't done anything to make him think otherwise.
Yeah, so same question to you, Mark, although I will pick up where Angela just left off. It's quite possible that if the Russians meet with the Ukrainians and then they say the Ukrainians are the obstacles to peace because they don't want to accept the land deals or whatever it is that the Russians do, that Trump could actually, to the contrary of actually increasing pressure on Russia, pull back on support for Ukraine, whether it's intelligence support or financial support or just being engaged in the conflict. Over the weekend, Marco Rubio, a man who seems to have been willing to sell all of his old principles and ideas away in order to get this job, said Americans don't really care about Ukraine. It doesn't really matter to them. And what do you think the body language, to use your phrase, of that suggests?
I think it's horrific. Number one, we care because it is a democratic nation trying to preserve their sovereignty and their territorial integrity and their democratic values. What concerns me the most, and I have a deep sense of dread, and it goes along with what Angela was saying is if there is a conclusion that there needs to be a trilateral conference between Putin, Trump, and Zelensky, that it's going to be a 2-against-1 kind of thing. The European leaders joined this to help out not only Zelensky, but themselves to stop Trump from doing what he was doing. If Russia, US, and Zelensky get in the room today, Zelensky is going to be made to look like the villain in all of this, which will be tragic and will be unbelievable. And you're right, David. I think President Trump is already setting the stage for that with some of the talking points his staff is using, like Secretary Rubio, but also some of the things he said on Fox this morning, which as I was listening to it, I just couldn't believe some of the things he was saying to the 3 interviewers, and they weren't pushing back on any of it. It was just amazing. But he is trying to set the stage as for Ukraine to be the obstacle for any future moves. And that's what really concerns me. I think you're right. I think there is a very high potential that there will be a stoppage of support for Ukraine while there won't be any additional sanctions. Rubio already said that. He said on Friday, hey, we've already sanctioned the Russians as much as we could over the last 2 years. He didn't mention any additional ones that Trump has put on because they haven't done that. So all these things factor in to a concern I have, a real dread, not a concern, that this is not going to go well. And we as a government are going to continue to back Putin, who's a war criminal and an autocrat and a kleptocrat, and turn away from a guy who's been fighting his ass off to save his country.
Yeah, no question about it. And I would add, as a final point, if I may add one of my own, that the world is watching. And if the United States ends up being on the side of aggressors getting to claim the land they seize illegally by military means, then stand by. Watch out, Taiwan. Watch what the message is to Bibi Netanyahu. Watch around the world. It is a terribly dangerous abandonment of a core principle of U.S. foreign policy since the Second World War. Well, look, I think everybody listening at the DSR network or listening because they subscribe to our Substack, are extremely fortunate to be able to go and sit down with really thoughtful, insightful experts like both of you. So thank you very much, Angela. Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be back with more on topics like this at the DSR Network and at the Need to Know Substack. Until then, bye-bye.
Thank you.